Of people in this town who you can count on to give you the scoop on what's really going on. And today we have author of Price of Paradise and Broken Trust, and he is one of the people in this town who we know will give us the truth on what's happening in government. Randall Roth, thank you for joining us today. He's a professor at the University of Hawaii.
Thank you, Malia.
And a very well-known author. And you've taken some tough stands in your history here in Hawaii.
Several times,
Several times, yeah. So we have lots of good things to talk about because there's so much happening at the legislature. There's so much happening with the new governor's new day and his plan, and lots of controversy at the legislature, as always, but this time maybe even more so over proposed tax hikes and pension raids and things like that. So you've been kind of taking a little bit of a back seat here lately at the University of Hawaii, but you've been watching. Right?
Well, my day job, as I call it, I'm a professor at the law school, and I love that job. For me, it's the dream job. But almost as a hobby, I guess, I've gotten involved in a lot of different civic issues. And beginning about 20 years ago, when we put together, some other people from the university and I put together a group to write a series of essays. We call it The Price of Paradise, and that comes from the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, or the price of paradise, this home we all love, is that we pay attention and that we talk about these issues. So we put together a couple of books addressing these various issues, intentionally talking about issues that were sensitive and controversial. And then my wife and I did a radio program at Hawaii Public Radio called The Price of Paradise, and it was a continuation of what we were doing with the books. And if you wanted to know what was my goal, it was just to elevate and increase the level of activity in the marketplace of ideas. I'm an academic, and I believe in the power of ideas. And so that's kind of how we got started. And then because of my areas of expertise, when I saw what I perceived to be major breaches of trust at what then we called Bishop Estate, now most people call it Kamehameha Schools, when I saw that, I felt an obligation as the only professor in those areas at the only law school in the state to help the public understand what those issues were all about. And that eventually was told in the Broken Trust essay and the Broken Trust book. And in 2003, I took a year leave from the university to serve as senior policy advisor to Governor Lingle during her first year. And that was my first opportunity to be in the middle of politics, and I learned quickly I'm not cut out for that. I'm an academic. I learned a lot from that year. I enjoyed that year. I thought a lot of Governor Lingle at the time. I think a lot of Governor Lingle now. But it was real clear to me that wasn't the best place for me. So I'm back where I started at the university, and I love my job, and I try to pay attention to the issues. Again, that's part of my belief, is that individuals in any community have a duty to do that.
So tell me about this essay. You wrote a really well-read essay in Honolulu Magazine, I believe it was, about education and transparency and things like that.
Right.
Tell me about that.
Well, a year or two ago, I was asked to write a piece where I would attempt to say what I thought the core issues, the fundamental issues were in Hawaii. And for me, it kind of boils down to accountability and transparency. And in a way, those are just words. And you hear those words so often, they can seem like they're rather empty. But what it boils down to is if you've got power, there's going to be a tendency to corruption. And if you have absolute power, it's going to be corrupt. I believe in the old adage. But with accountability and transparency, then you kind of counterbalance that power. And for whatever reason in Hawaii, we have a lot of concentrations of power where there really isn't accountability, there really isn't transparency. And the Bishop Estate controversy is Exhibit A. I mean, there's a perfect example of where you had phenomenal power without accountability and transparency. So in that article, I gave that and a number of other examples. And I think we as a community, if we better understand that for whatever reason we're deficient in those areas, I think our chances of improving are increased.
So, okay, you have the legislature looking at, tax increases, and there's all this talk about fiscal responsibility. You were down at the legislature. You worked for Governor Lingle for a while. and as her, what was the title? I can't remember now.
I was the Senior Policy Advisor.
Senior Policy Advisor, so you're right in there in the middle of everything.
That's kind of like consultant.
Consultant, okay. But so what is your perspective on what's going on right now? I mean, even you'll be affected, I'm sure, by the pension issue. You're a tax attorney, and I'm sure you can give a good insight on the proposal by Governor Abercrombie to suddenly tax pensions of the retirees.
Well, and I'm nearing retirement age, and so I can personally relate to that. My concern is that Governor Abercrombie has not yet laid what I would describe as a foundation, not provided what I would describe as an essential context. If he's going to ask retirees receiving pension income, for example, to pay taxes on income that's never been taxed before in Hawaii, he needs to explain how that fits into the overall picture. In my opinion, although he said we have a terrible, terrible fiscal situation, I don't think he's really explained it to the public in a way that they can understand, because it is a bad situation. The promises that our elected officials in Hawaii have made to others, especially to the unions, the promises that they've made in the past and not funded are almost unbelievably big. There was an article in the New York Times about 2 weeks ago, and it was about Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, and it was saying that he has all these unfunded liabilities for promised pensions and promised retiree health care that, according to the New York Times, simply can't be paid, won't be paid. The numbers are simply too big ever to seriously think that the state could make good on those promises. And Hawaii's situation on a per household basis is worse than New Jersey's. And in fact, according to the data that the New York Times provided, we're the worst in the nation. The amount that our elected officials have legally contracted this state to pay to people like me, if reduced to a current figure, what funding would we need in order to be fully funded, is on a per household basis the highest in the nation. It's worse than California, it's worse than New Jersey, it's worse than New York. You take all the states that are presenting themselves as fiscal basket cases, and we're worse. I don't think Governor Abercrombie has made that clear. I don't think he's made clear that our income tax rates go up to the highest level in the nation. They're talking about raising it. They're saying, well, high-income people can always afford to pay more. Well, I think he needs to explain that we're already at the highest rate in the nation. And I think he needs to explain, too, that our state excise tax, on the surface, it's only 4% or 4.5% on Oahu, but it translates into the equivalent of an 11% state sales tax.
Or higher, depending on how many levels of service, right?
When we wrote the first Price of Paradise book 20 years ago, we actually had the top expert in the country on consumption taxes come out, do a very elaborate study, very detailed, and he concluded that at that time, if we converted to a sales tax, we would need a rate of 16% to generate as much revenue as the 4% excise tax generated at that time. Well, in part because of the publicity that got, the legislature enacted a number of provisions, typically referred to now as the exemption provisions, that were intended to reduce that, so that today, the last figure I saw from the Tax Review Commission was that it equates to an 11% sales tax. But the legislature now is talking about doing away with those exemptions and making other changes that, again, would make it a far more burdensome tax than what it appears to be. And although Governor Abercrombie stated in no uncertain terms during the campaign that he wasn't going to raise the excise tax, words are cheap, and
we'll see what actually happens.
Well,
right?
Again, I don't want to criticize him because so far the words have been fine, but there are going to be some very tough decisions that are going to have to be made under very tough circumstances. And although his rhetoric has been great, I haven't seen him take any hard positions with respect to the unions as political forces, and I haven't seen him help the public understand why sacrifices are going to have to be made by certain parties in certain ways. He certainly hasn't explained why it is that it can be counterproductive to get your tax rates too high. And so in the absence of helping the public understand the context in which he's asking pension recipients to pay income taxes, I think is just creating a whole bunch of frustration and irritation, and it's so unnecessary, again, because, and he's an excellent orator, and he's a former professor, so his ability to do it is there. It's just that when that message is explained clearly, I think the public understands that there's some major changes with respect to the unions, the public sector unions, that just have to be made. Sooner or later just have to be made. And I think Governor Abercrombie just doesn't want to do that any sooner than is absolutely necessary. And my fear is that it's going to be pushed down the road so many times that by the time it becomes clear it has to be done, the pain to everybody, including union members, I think will be dramatic, much worse than if we had a plan and got started on the plan now.
Well, I think there's really a lot of, it seems like a mixed messages going on, because you have the governor saying that he's going to increase the percentage the state pays on, for example, health care for some union members to make it even with the county and the state, so that I guess it's 60% instead of 50% for everybody. And so that's $18 million. But then you have him saying he's going to tax pensions. And so to me, there's been some mixed messages. And then there's negotiations going on. And yet there's the state budget director saying we have to cut spending by 10% in all departments. So I'm not exactly sure what the story is. It's really hard to figure out.
Well, we're filming this in late March, and maybe someday by the time people are watching this, we'll know more. Next week. Good.
Yeah.
But I've got to tell you, it just doesn't seem to me like the really hard decisions are being made. That Governor Abercrombie talks about keeping down taxes, for example, but then he talks about the need to invest. You know, invest. It's just another word for spend. And you know, under different fiscal circumstances, spending or investing, whatever word you choose, it can make sense for the government to be doing some things that it hasn't previously been doing. But today, in the context of what a lot of experts are calling a fiscal train wreck, to be talking about investing / spending, it's like, hasn't he gotten it yet? And sooner or later he will. And maybe he has, he's just taken a while to adjust. But these are not good times. And I've been predicting that he'd spend the rainy day fund and he would spend the hurricane fund first year he's out. And I've been predicting that he would increase excise tax. And I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong. But that's the path of least resistance for now. It's just that that's going to lead to bigger problems down the road.
Well, funny you should say that about the fiscal rates, because today at the legislature, they were talking, you know, the budget director, Calbert Young, was talking to the Senate Ways and Means Committee about rating the hurricane fund, the rest of the hurricane fund, the rest of the rainy day fund, and then doing a quote-unquote sweep of all the other special funds. Not, I don't know if all the special funds, but several of the special funds, in order to balance the state budget just to get to the end of the year. Yeah. And so, you know, we're talking, or the end of this fiscal year, which is June, this is March. So here they're talking about sweeping out all of the savings, any kind of, you know, preparation for disaster. We just saw what happened in Japan. $300 billion is what we heard is going to cost so far. Yeah. You know, if anything like that hit Hawaii, are we prepared? Do we have money stored up? Well, what if they use it? I mean, what is your thoughts on that?
Well, what I'd like to see Governor Abercrombie do, rather than just spend everything that's available in a way that makes it seem like it's panic spending or panic investing, however you want to describe it, I'd like him to really explain to the public, you know, where we are, where we need to be, how we're going to get from here to there. And on special funds, for example, I think he owes it to the public to say, here's what these special funds are. Here's how they came to exist. Here's how they're being used. Here's why I'm not going to take this one. Here's why I'm going to take that one. If he kind of had a class, and he doesn't have to do it all at once, but if there was some effort to help the public get it, to see just what the choices are, and then if he would make not just the obvious ones, but the tough ones, I think he could be a great governor. I think he has an opportunity to be a real hero, because this is a fiscal crisis But thus far, I've had a hard time seeing any prioritization. I've seen a hard time seeing any methodical effort to help the public understand why he's pushing this, that, or the other thing. But we'll see. Hopefully he's going to do all of that.
Well, I've had people ask me, do I think he knows what he's doing? You know, because he's always been in Congress, and now suddenly he's in a whole different ballgame. He's in state government. He's heading the state. He's got all these budget issues, and it keeps getting tougher and tougher with the Council on Revenues, you know, projecting what it was a 2% increase this year, then now it's a 0.5%, and then they're going to meet again to say what. And so do you think, I mean, what's your feeling?
I think he's a very smart man. I think he's got a lot of experience in legislature, in Congress. I think he's got some very good advisors. If he doesn't completely get it yet, he will soon. The numbers, I think, have a tendency to kind of remove the label Democrat or Republican, or I think of myself as a small L libertarian, a 19th century liberal. But whatever the label, whatever the political philosophy, once you understand the nature of this fiscal challenge, and especially if you understand the problems of letting your tax rates get high, that can be counterproductive, that can hurt your economy, it can hurt government revenues. And there's so many things we're learning from other states that I'm very guardedly optimistic that Governor Abercrombie will make some changes that we have to make here. But thus far, you know, I haven't seen a framework for that.
No, I did notice that some of the senators who were talking about raising the general excise tax before are now getting very concerned about, does the governor have a plan? And that's the kind of questions they're asking. You know, what is the plan to bring revenue into the state without raising taxes? What is your 6-year plan? What is your immediate plan? You know, some of the answers come out. Construction, there's a $1.3 billion construction program going on. The rail, which we can talk about, the $5.5 billion rail, which may or may not be built. Those are the two things that are in the 6-year plan for long-term supposed growth, economic growth. Short-term, really, there is nothing.
Well, and to me, rail, which, you know, it's heavy rail. I think it's going to be a blight on the environment in a number of ways, especially the visual planes. They've acknowledged in the environmental impact statement that it's not going to make traffic better when it's finished, that compared to today, the congestion is going to be worse than it is today. And I emphasize that because I think for the most part, they've sold it in what I perceive to be a very dishonest way. They've sold it as a way to solve today's traffic congestion problem, and that's just a lie. That's simply not true. And I think they've sold it as being the environmentally responsible alternative, and it simply isn't. And you can approach that and document that from a number of different directions. I think more recently they've been a little bit more honest about stressing the job creation side, but they're basically saying government can spend money better than can the private sector, even though these are just temporary jobs. I just see it as a political move, a real estate move. Yeah, if it were free, I'd rather have it than not have it, but especially given the fiscal challenges that we face right now, I just think there are much better, much cheaper ways to deal with the traffic congestion problem. I'm a big fan of public transportation, by the way. My wife and I met on a city bus number 6 in Denver, Colorado. Yeah. And my point is that I used to ride the bus, and I think public transportation is very important. It's just this rail is not a public transportation solution, in my opinion. It's really all about, I don't want to say political payoffs, but it's helping the folks who provided the help to the people who are now elected officials. I think the more the public understands about rail, the more upset they'll be about the way it's been sold, and the more determined they'll be to stop this while it's still stoppable.
Well, basically, you're just helping the steel workers. And, you know, when they talk about job creation, I really wonder about that, because how are you going to bring, you know, they're going to have to import people to do some of these jobs, right?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds so good to spend billions and billions of dollars in Hawaii, but why don't we just leave those tax dollars with people and trust how they're going to spend it, and recognize that it will help small businesses in particular to the extent that you're keeping those rates down.
And also, that's very good, but also, don't you think that there's something to all the other things we need to fix? We have roads with potholes, we have water mains that keep breaking, sewer problems.
Well, absolutely, and I think part of the effort to sell the public on rail has been to kind of shortchange some of these things that would make the traffic problem less of a problem. You know, I do want to mention something else that I feel particularly strongly about, and that is public education in Hawaii. It seems to me that there are so many ways that the system could be better for the kids than it currently is. And I think this move from an elected board to an appointed board is a very good move. Maybe they'll have, quote, better board members because of the appointed process, but that's really not what's motivating me in supporting an appointed board. I just want the governor to have as much responsibility for public education as possible, and if that board is an extension of him, if they're reflecting what his vision for public education is, it takes us a step closer to being able to hold him accountable. Before, we had the governor with just enough power to frustrate the board and frustrate the legislature, and the legislature with enough power to frustrate the other two. Each one could make sure that the other didn't get anything right, didn't get their vision put into place, and yet no one of them could actually take the public education system where they wanted it to go. So it was a system where nobody could be held accountable. Giving the governor control over who's on the board moves us in the direction of being able to hold somebody accountable for system-wide results, but we need to do one more step. We need to get the legislature out of the super school board business. Right now, instead of lump sum budgeting to where they say to the governor and the school board, here's how much money you have to spend, $2.4 billion, whatever the total number would be, instead of lump sum budgeting, they do all this earmarking, categorical funding to where they're functioning like a school board, and they just need to get out of that. Act 51, the so-called Reinventing Education Act, had, I believe it was 24 specific changes, 23 of which could have been made by the board, by itself, without any legislation. So it was a perfect example of the legislature just trumping the board, saying, well, you're not doing it, needs to be done, we're going to do it. The legislature has to stop that. And so if, in addition to the appointed board, they would go to lump sum budgeting and stay out of the super school board business, that would be a huge step forward. And then, very importantly, we got to get the principals out of the union. I know a bunch of principals, and I've gotten to know them very well, and I really like them. I mean, there's some really good people that are principals in our schools, but it just doesn't make sense that you would make CEOs members of a union, to where you say, you know, we're going to hold you accountable, but no matter what the results are, you're going to get paid the same amount as everybody else, the same benefits as everybody else, and you got tenure. Imagine somebody applying for a CEO position at a bank or who knows where, saying, I'll take the job, but my compensation has to be totally unrelated to performance, my benefits totally unrelated, and I got to have tenure. It makes no sense. And then, of course, if you're going to hold principals accountable for what goes on in the school, you got to give them control over who's in the classroom. You can't leave this current system in place where it can take them years to move a teacher out of the classroom where it's just not working. If we really cared about the kids and we wanted it to be the best possible educational opportunity for them, we'd get the principals out of the union, we would change these work rules and personnel rules to where the principals could really control who's in the classroom. We'd deploy the resources very differently, and we could finally have a system where people could be held accountable. And we've got good people in the system. We just have a governance structure that lacks accountability and, frankly, lacks transparency as well.
Do you think this public education system is underfunded? We always hear about it being underfunded, and they want more money, and they need more money to make it operate, and they need more money to improve test scores.
Yeah, clearly don't need more money. More money is always better than less money. There's no question about it. But if you compare how much we're spending here per child to any place else, there are a lot of different ways of trying to make a rough cut at whether we're spending enough or not. By every measurement that I've attempted to apply, we're spending enough. I'd rather have more, no question about it, and if times were booming, right, I'd be out there saying, well, let's do some additional things in education that we're not doing now and spend more on facilities and air conditioning, a whole bunch of things. But if you compare us to other public school systems, and you make the various adjustments for different cost of living and everything else, clearly money is not the problem right now.
So you think it's been governance and just the whole big bureaucracy trying to maneuver that, or what do you think the main problem is?
Well, what matters is what goes on in the schools, in the classrooms, and yet we've taken all the control over their situation away from the teachers and frankly away from the principals, just in the way the whole thing is structured. We've got the most top-down centralized system in the country, and the culture of the DOE is that those schools and teachers are working for, quote, us, the DOE central administrators, and it just doesn't work. You've got to align the resources with responsibility, and when we talk about responsibility, it's how are those kids doing? And it makes no sense whatsoever that we're not measuring how those kids are progressing on an individual basis and giving principals the ability to make changes in the classroom when, for whatever reason, it's simply not working for the kids. There's some basic things that in this race to the top effort, in theory, we're going to be making some changes, but in the past at least, starting with the teachers union and the principals union, there have been politically powerful forces that have had an ability to stop this unique and uniquely flawed public school system in Hawaii, to stop from having true reform. They've called it reform in the past, but in my opinion, they've successfully resisted true reform. And I think if Governor Abercrombie would just help the public understand how that is, why that is, I think the public would support him, and I think he could stand up to the unions, but I just haven't seen it yet.
Well, I can't believe it. Our show's already over. We could talk on for an hour, maybe 2 hours about all the things that need to be done in Hawaii. But maybe we'll have you as be our next governor.
No, I love my job.
Okay.
Don't take my job away from me.
Well, we hope to see more books coming out from you, and will there be more books?
Sure, I'm working on something.
All right, okay, well, you heard it here first, right?
Okay.
Thanks, Randall Roth, for joining us today. And you can always check out his books, The Price of Paradise and Broken Trust. Thank you for joining us. This has been News Behind the News. Aloha.
Can they hear those noises?